I'm Gadi Levy. I'm the Executive Director of the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center, and I'm honored to welcome you to a discussion about what we already know, or think we know, or at least pretend to know, whether we admit it or not. That is the topic of Steven Pinker's new book, When Everyone Knows That Everyone Knows, in which the Harvard social psychologist asks questions few of us ever stop to consider. Why do we hoard our toilet paper at the first sign of a crisis? Why do we care so much about what other people know? And why are these questions important enough to occupy the mind of a two-time Pulitzer Prize finalist and author of 12 acclaimed books, a thinker Time magazine named one of the 100 most influential people in the world today? He is here tonight to explain why these questions matter, not just in theory, but also in our daily lives, shaping everything from how we drive to how we maintain friendships. In conversation with our great friend, Frank Bruni of Duke University and the New York Times. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Steve Pinker and Frank Bruni.
Good evening, everybody. I am so honored and delighted to be here with you. Thank you for sharing your evening with all of us.
I am honored as well. Thank you for agreeing to have this conversation.
And I want to thank you, before we get to the book, which we'll spend some time on, I want to thank you for something in particular, because it's really something general. You wrote a piece for the New York Times not that many months ago about the Trump administration's attack on Harvard, about a certain kind of Harvard derangement syndrome, I think you called it. And I just thought it exemplified what is so important and admirable, one of the many things that's so important and admirable about your work. You talked, as you had in the past, about the excesses of wokeness at Harvard. You talked about ways in which things had sometimes gone astray, but you also talked about how the attack on it was disproportionate to that. You talked about how it doesn't define the university. It's so rare these days to read things and to hear people speak in a way that embraces nuance, and that doesn't seem to simply be in one lane, shirts or skins, red or blue, et cetera. I want to compliment you and thank you for that, but also ask you, is that hard at times? Do you have people who say, Stephen, pick a lane, whose side are you on?
Indeed, and as a co-founder and co-president of the Council on Academic Freedom at Harvard, which originally we founded to kind of push back against the deplatforming, the disinvitations, the cancellation of people with unpopular views at Harvard. Well, now we're facing a far more severe attack from the federal government, and that is by far the more serious attack, because the federal government controls money, and they have guns, and the Department of Romance, Languages, and Literatures, for all the threats to academic freedom, is just not nearly as formidable. But there is some pressure now not to criticize anything that happens within Harvard, because it would be used as ammunition for the Trump administration. So don't give comfort to the enemy. And there is a lot of pressure to keep the criticism one-sided. I think that would be unwise, and my response to that is that one of the reasons for the strong-arming of Harvard by the Trump administration, and the reason that has a certain amount of sympathy even from people who aren't in the administration, and I just know this from the letters I get, is that there's a feeling that universities are incapable of internally reforming. They work by peer review, which means professors conferring prestige on professors, and so they can get trapped in their own self-affirming cliques. Nothing short of a gun to the head will get them to reform. So I'm saying, look, we got to convince the country that narrative is false, that we actually are capable of reform from within. And so when there is something wrong in the university, we should point it out and do better.
If you've got a whole community of professors worried about handing ammunition that they didn't intend to the Trump administration, worrying about kind of saying something that draws more ire, how does education happen if, no, seriously, if everybody is sort of, in a sense, looking over his or her shoulder?
Well, and indeed, that's the reason why academic freedom is a cardinal virtue in universities, that you can't teach or do research if you constantly have to worry, will this offend this side, will it offend that side? If what you're hoping to do is pursue truth, veritas is the motto of Harvard, Latin for truth, and to convey it, then often the truth has surprises for both sides. And so unless you have a disinterested commitment to find out the way the world works, what makes us tick, and not have to worry who will it offend, you're never going to approach the truth.
We'll come back to higher ed later, but I want to talk about the book that is on the screen behind us. Congratulations on it. It's been out about 5 weeks, 6 weeks, right?
That's right, yes.
I apologize in advance. I'm going to ask you some questions you've answered before, because a lot of people in the audience are just learning about the book and its concepts right now. But for starters, the basic question, what is the difference between individual knowledge, mutual knowledge, and what you're writing about, which is common knowledge?
Yes, so I'm writing about a state called common knowledge in a technical sense, which differs from the way we use it in ordinary conversation. In ordinary conversation, common knowledge means something that is widely known, conventional wisdom, sometimes knowledge that is privately known, such as it was common knowledge in the Democratic Party that Joe Biden was suffering decline, meaning they didn't talk about it, but kind of everyone privately knew it. So annoyingly, that's almost the opposite to the technical meaning. Right? The technical meaning of common knowledge is captured in the title of the book, when everyone knows that everyone knows, ... and the ... means that everyone knows that, and everyone knows that, and everyone knows that, ad infinitum. Or if it's only two people, then it means I know something, you know it, I know that you know it, you know that I know it, I know that you know that I know it, and so on ad infinitum. So that's the common knowledge in the technical sense, and it can be distinguished from private knowledge, where everyone might know something without knowing that everyone else knows it. And so I illustrate it, and I open the book with probably the most famous story about common knowledge, in which when the little boy said the emperor was naked, he wasn't telling them anything they didn't already know, privately. They could see the emperor was naked. But he changed the state of their knowledge, nonetheless, by blurting out what everyone could see within earshot of the others. Now, everyone knew that everyone else knew that everyone else knew that the emperor was naked. So he made private knowledge common knowledge. And that made a difference, as in the story, where it changed their social relationship with the emperor from obsequious deference to ridicule and scorn. So I started the book with that story because it illustrates three key points which keep recurring through the book. One of them is that there's a huge difference between private knowledge and common knowledge, that is, knowing something and knowing that everyone knows that you know it. Second is, common knowledge doesn't have to involve the mental exercise of thinking, I know that she knows that I know that she knows that I know that she knows. I mean, your mind starts to spin after 2 or 3 levels, as in the episode of The Princess Bride, where there's a battle of wits, where Vizzini has to figure out where Wesley thinks he thinks that Wesley thinks that he thinks that Wesley thinks he's put the poison, and to try to outthink him. So we don't have to do that for common knowledge. It's amusing when we see that played out, but common knowledge can be generated in a stroke when there is some event that is public, conspicuous, salient, self-evident, you can't miss it, it's in your face, such as the little boy blurting it out. So that's the second theme of the book, namely common knowledge doesn't necessarily require, I use the fancy term, recursive mentalizing. Mentalize means get in someone else's head. Recursive mentalizing means get inside the head of someone while they're trying to get inside your head or someone else's head. So you don't necessarily need to do that. We can, but we can appreciate common knowledge in the sense that something is out there, you can't miss it, it's in your face. And the third one is that social relationships, including deference, or equality, or friendship, or love, are negotiated by common knowledge. What makes two people friends, what makes one defer to the other, what makes them lovers, what makes them transactional partners, is each one knows that the other one knows that the first one knows that the second one knows they do. So those are three themes that keep recurring through the book.
So what, in the case of Biden, which you brought up just a moment ago, what was the equivalent of the boy saying the emperor has no clothes? What was the hinge from private to common knowledge?
Yeah, so it's a great illustration, because it was private knowledge, and again, it's really a nuisance that academics kind of had to take a word that had one meaning and give it another meaning. But anyway, it's kind of common knowledge in not the sense that I'm using it. That is, it was private knowledge among the administration, among Democrats in the country as a whole, that he was probably too old to run for president. And public opinion polls showed that something like 2/3 of Americans thought that in the spring of 2024. Then he had a debate on television with Donald Trump, late June 2024, in which it became painfully obvious that he was in the midst of cognitive decline. Now, there was a slight increase in the percentage of Americans who thought he was too old to be president. I think it was from 66% to 73%. I forget the exact numbers. But it moved the needle, but just a bit. But it changed everything. Why? Well, when you were watching the debate on national TV, you knew that the whole country was watching the debate, and everyone watching knew that everyone was watching. So there was now, what previously was private knowledge was now common knowledge in the technical sense, and that changed everything. You could no longer maintain that he could, publicly maintain that he could run for president now that it was common knowledge. So it was a kind of emperor's new clothes moment, and a number of pundits made the comparison.
So you needed that to happen, even though if I'm reading the papers, to go back to your poll numbers, I'm seeing that, okay, I'm privately believing Biden's too old. I can see 68% of Americans agree with me. I still need something more to be comfortable in the assumption that they agree with me, or?
Yes, that once it's public, once you say it, then that changes everything. That is, once you say it explicitly, once you leave the realm of genteel euphemism and politeness, but you blurt it out. Blurting generates common knowledge. In fact, that's why we so often use innuendo, euphemism, beating around the bush, catching my drift. It's precisely when we want to avoid generating common knowledge that we do that.
So what's a situation in which I use innuendo because I want to avoid that common knowledge, and why do I want to avoid that common knowledge? Is this sort of like you talked in one of your interviews about two people on the sidewalk and one says, do you want to come upstairs? Is that
Yes.
in that vicinity, or?
Precisely. Or to be more explicit, late at night, at the end of a pleasant date, do you want to come upstairs for coffee, or to see my etchings, or for Netflix and chill?
Pet my cat.
Pet my cat.
Meet my dog.
Enjoy the view. So in a case like that, where the subtext, of course, is that it's a sexual proposition. But it doesn't need to be said that there's a huge social and emotional difference between do you want to come up and for Netflix and chill, and do you want to come up and have sex? Even though any grown adult knows what come up for Netflix and chill at 11:30 p.m. means. So it's not, any deniability isn't plausible. But in fact, this is how I got into this whole topic, from my interest in language, because it's well known among linguists that an awful lot of conversation does not consist of people coding their thoughts in words and syntax and kind of algorithmically delivering a message. There's an awful lot of inference and guesswork and filling in the blanks and connecting the dots in real human conversation. So this being an example. So why do we cut the crap? Why do we use these weasel words when everyone knows what's being said? Well, my hypothesis is, yeah, everyone knows, but everyone doesn't know that everyone knows. That is, let's say he says, do you want to come up for Netflix and chill? And she says, no, thank you. I got to get to bed early. She knows she's turned down a sexual proposition. And she's a grown woman, and he knows she's turned down a sexual proposition. But does she know that he knows that she knows? She could still think, well, maybe he thinks I'm naive. Maybe he thinks that I just turned down an invitation to watch Netflix. And does he know that she knows that he knows? He could think, well, maybe she thinks I'm dense. Maybe she thinks that I don't realize that she's onto what's really going on. And that way, they can maintain the fiction of a purely platonic friendship, or if they're colleagues, that they're nothing but colleagues, whereas blurting it out would generate the common knowledge that the basis of their relationship is no longer the logic and norms of friendship, but something different, and there's that feeling that you can't go back. And that feeling is accompanied by a distinctive emotion that we call awkwardness. Awkwardness comes about when you have one relationship is in force and a person acts according to a norm that's appropriate for a different kind of relationship. And one of the chapters of the book, they're called the Department of Social Relations, former name of my department at Harvard, is about the different kinds of relationships we have and what is appropriate or not within each relationship. I argue that we subdivide them pretty cleanly, that each one is cemented by certain kinds of common knowledge generating signals. If you're friends, you go out for a meal together, you go out for a ball game, or you have some common experience, you shake hands, you hug. If you're in love, you cement it by saying, I love you, reciprocated, I love you, and so on. To maintain the friendship, or the romance, or the hierarchical relationship, the signals continue to be sent. If you have to tender some proposition or convey some information that would challenge the nature of the relationship, that is, if it were common knowledge, if each one knows the other one knows that the other one knows, then you sometimes avoid that by framing your intentions in direct speech and innuendo. And it isn't just the example of a sexual proposition. In, say, tendering a bribe, so imagine that you're in a situation where you want to be seated at a table at a restaurant in Manhattan on a Saturday night, you don't have a reservation, and it occurs to you, maybe if you slip the maitre d' a 50, you can jump the queue. This is an actual assignment given to a food writer a number of years ago in Gourmet magazine, whose editor dared him to try it and write up his experience for the magazine, for the late lamented Gourmet magazine. And what I found interesting reading this article was that, for one thing, the assignment terrified him. And here we get to the emotion of awkwardness. That is, he begins the article by saying, as I bounce through the streets of Manhattan in a taxi, I keep imagining the incensed retorts of some enraged maitre d'. How dare you insult me? What kind of establishment do you think this is? Do you think you can get in with that? That's what's running through his imagination.
Translation, why didn't you give me 100, right?
Well, it could be that. But what interested me, as someone interested in language, is how he tendered the bribe. He would hold the bill out in peripheral vision, being careful not to look at it, but still making sure that it was visible. And he would say something like, I was wondering if you might have a cancellation. Or, is there any way to shorten my wait? Or, this is a really important night for me. Not, if I give you 50, will you let me jump the queue? The third thing that I learned from the article is that it worked every time. So here's an interesting take-home lesson. If you remember nothing else, 100% of Manhattan maitre d's are bribable. So, I'll give you one other example of,
news you can use, right?
News you can use. So anyone who's in any kind of nonprofit knows that there's this whole part of the operation called fundraising. And I've been at universities, and universities wine and dine, as they put it, high net worth individuals, rich people. And sometimes I'm brought along as the entertainment, so it'll be the dean or the president, the high net worth individual, and me out for dinner. And I noticed that it kind of felt like a nervous, hot date. That is, everyone knew what was on everyone's mind, but you couldn't say it. So the dean would say things like, well, we're hoping that you'll be a friend to the university. That, we have our campaign for the future, and we hope you'll be our partner in the campaign for the future. Never, well, here's the deal. If you give us $50 million, we'll put your name on the entrance to a building, or we'll name a professorship after you. I mean, the time for that comes, but there has to be the simulation of friendship, and again, the indirect speech. Not that it could fool anyone. The high net worth individual knows why they're there for dinner. But if you make it common knowledge, if you say, look, we all know why we're here, we're trying to squeeze some money out of you, it would change the relationship. It would no longer feel like a simulated friendship.
You said to me backstage that it was when you were either a child or a young man in Temple that you first started thinking about common knowledge. Can you
Yes, before I had a name for it, as a Sunday school student in Montreal, we also have a Temple Emanu-El, by the way, and I always thought of it as the rich temple. I belonged to the poor temple, Temple Beth Shalom, but eventually went out of business and got absorbed by Temple Emanu-El. But anyway, in Sunday school, I learned about something that some of you may know about, and that is Maimonides' ladder of tzedakah, sometimes called the ladder of charity, from the great rabbi, astronomer, physician, Moshe ben Maimon, Moshe, son of Maimon, Maimonides in Greek, acronym Rambam, Rabbi Moses ben Maimon. And among his contributions was a analysis of charitable giving according to how righteous he deemed it to be, which did not just depend on the size of the gift, but on the circumstances of giving. And there were 8 rungs on this ladder. The highest rung, not surprisingly, was obviating the need for charity at all. You give someone a starter loan, you go into partnership with them, you teach them a skill, you teach a man to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. That's the highest rung. The next one down is what we might call double-blind donation. The patron puts the money or the gold or the food in a kind of community chest, goes away, the poor person opens it, picks it out, poor person doesn't know who the rich one is, and vice versa. One rung down from that is when the beneficiary is known to the donor, but not vice versa. So the rich person leaves a package of money on the doorstep of a poor person in the dead of night, scampers away, poor person opens the door, retrieves the money. The donor knows the beneficiary, but not vice versa. Then there's a rung below that, and that's when the knowledge state is reversed. The beneficiary knows the donor, but not vice versa. And Maimonides said the great sages used to walk around with coins in the back of their robes, and poor people would kind of scamper behind them and pick the coins out of the robes. So beneficiary knows donor, but not vice versa. A rung below that is common knowledge. Maimonides didn't use that term. Donor knows the beneficiary and vice versa. The rich person puts money into the hands of the poor person. That's the third to lowest rung. Then lower still is if it's given grudgingly, if not enough is given, etc. But he differentiated 4 kinds of giving, not by how well off the beneficiary was, how much food he could buy, but by who knew what about the other. And so it kind of stuck with me, why that would make a difference. And being a snarky 11-year-old, I said, well, if anonymous giving is so righteous, then I said to the teacher, how come every pew and every fixture here in Temple Beth Shalom has the name of the donor on it? But of course, there is a reason why they have had those little plaques. I don't know if in the back of your seats there are plaques for the donors. And that is, of course, it incentivizes donation. One might even think that there's something perverse about Maimonides' ladder, because if you reward a donor, that incentivizes future donors because they want the reputation, the kavod, as they say in Yiddish, the kaved, the honor, and there's more giving, and so poor people are better off. Why? How could that possibly be worse? And of course, this being a rabbi, inevitably there's another rabbi who had made the opposite argument, and indeed there was. So it turns out that Rabbi Shlomo ben Avraham, the Rashba, argued that there is a duty to publicize, mitzvah lefarseh, with the logic that it inspires others to replicate the good deed. And no doubt centuries of rabbis have debated which is which. And so, anyway, that's what first led me to think about states of mutual knowledge. Who knows what about whom? Now, first of all, what's the rationale? Well, I mean, what was Maimonides thinking? I actually did some experiments with some postdocs and students at Harvard. First of all, to see if Maimonides had intuitions that we share today. And by and large, we do. That is, people do judge a double-blind donor as more charitable, more likely to donate again than a common knowledge donor, known to the other. They actually disagreed with Maimonides on one rung. And you probably got the sense that when the poor person is kind of scampering behind the rich person picking coins out of his backpack, that's actually a little demeaning. And so people judge that to be no better, maybe even a little bit worse than actually putting the money into the beneficiary's hand. But the other rungs were in the right order. And the explanation would be, when we're judging righteousness, we're making a judgment of the person's character, their soul, what they do in the marrow, just because it's right, not because of any payback in terms of either reputation or calling in the favor later. But in a double-blind donation, you can't call in the favor because you don't know who benefited from the favor. You can't be doing it for the reputation because no one knows about it. So if you're doing it, that must show that you're dispositionally, in the bone, in the marrow, a generous person. Whereas a common knowledge gift, you could be, like, you remember the first scene of The Godfather, where Vito Corleone says to the supplicant, someday, and that day may never come, I will ask you to do me a service. And on that day, I expect you to remember the favor that I gave to you on my daughter's wedding day. Well, you really don't want to be in debt to the Godfather. And so a common knowledge gift, as with the Godfather, is perceived as less righteous. But then I have to add that this whole sort of paradoxical glory or righteousness that we impute to an anonymous donor, which of course we can't do if he's really anonymous, was taken up by another great Jewish thinker, Larry David. In an episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm, which some of you may have seen, called The Anonymous Donor, where it almost could have come out of a debate between the Rambam and the Rashba, where there's a ceremony to cut the ribbon of a new headquarters of a nonprofit, and Larry David donated the money for one wing, and then a plaque on the wall that says, donated by Larry David. Then there's another wing, and it says, donated by Anonymous. And everyone's gushing over how generous this anonymous donor was. And then, of course, it leaks out that it was Ted Danson, his social rival. So Danson got the benefit both of the getting credit for the generous donation and getting credit for the anonymity, which paradoxically was contradicted by the fact that everyone knew who it was. And so Larry David said, rather peeved, said, I didn't know I could have been anonymous and gotten credit for it. I would have taken that option, okay? And by the way, crucially, another instance of common knowledge, it had to be spread by whispers that Danson was the anonymous donor. If it was common knowledge that it was the anonymous donor, that would have contradicted the anonymity and negated the reputational advantage.
That's a hell of a needle thread, right? So we'll never know how generous President Trump has been with his anonymous donations, for which there was no put my name on the building. We'll never know, right?
We'll never know.
That's a shame. That's a shame. You write in the book, and I'm paraphrasing, I may not have the words correctly, about common knowledge being the invisible architecture of society. And it kind of underpins our political institutions, our financial markets. Can you give like a quick example of each of what you mean when you say that it is what underpins, animates our political institutions, our financial markets?
Yeah, so the subtitle of the book is Common Knowledge and the Mysteries of Money, Power, and Everyday Life. You know, we've talked plenty about everyday life. But for money, even the institution of money itself, it depends on common knowledge. Why do I accept some green pieces of paper in exchange for something of value, like an old couch? Well, because I know that other people will accept it in exchange for something else. And why do they accept it? Well, they know that still other people will accept it. So the money works by common knowledge of its value and nothing but common knowledge. And that can evaporate in the case of, say, hyperinflation. And our financial institutions likewise depend on common knowledge of their solvency. No bank has enough reserves to redeem all the deposits at once. People have trust that when they go to the bank, they have common knowledge, one could say, that there'll be enough reserves to cover it. But when that common knowledge doesn't exist, you can have people withdrawing money out of the fear that other people are withdrawing their money, even only out of the fear that still others are fearful of others withdrawing money, with the bank, the latecomers being kind of holding the bag, with there being no reserves left to pay them off. And so that can sink a bank, that can sink an economy. That's what happened during the Great Depression. And so when Franklin Roosevelt said, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, that was a statement of common knowledge or common expectation. And one of the ways in which Roosevelt kind of stanched this self-fulfilling cycle is he declared a bank holiday, a period in which no one could withdraw anything. And the idea wasn't to protect the bank, but to reassure everyone that everyone else wasn't withdrawing their money. And then introducing prominently displayed federal deposit insurance. Many banks have a big brass plaque or a brass decal in the window saying that the deposits are covered by federal insurance up to $250,000, and so no one has to worry about quickly withdrawing their savings. Before that, one of the reasons that banks were so opulent, even in small towns, they had marble columns and gilt lettering, was before there was federal deposit insurance. Everyone could see that the bank was opulent and could see that everyone else could see that, and that was meant to generate the common knowledge that the bank if it was rich enough to afford the marble, it was rich enough to pay off its depositors. And there are a number of other phenomena, speculative bubbles and crashes. You buy crypto because you think everyone else is buying crypto. By the way, generated often by as with the Biden television debate, anything that is on national TV generates common knowledge, and that's why a couple of years ago all the crypto exchanges bought high-concept Super Bowl ads, because everyone knows that everyone watches the Super Bowl, and so you can gin up a common expectation of rising prices by advertising in a prominent forum. For power, no government in the world has enough firepower to intimidate every last one of its citizens. I quote a line from the movie Gandhi, in which the character says to a British colonial officer, "In the end you will leave, because 100,000 Englishmen simply cannot control 350 million Indians if the Indians refuse to cooperate." What could make 350 million Indians or any number of citizens refuse to cooperate, and therefore cause regime change? Well, one thing is a free press. The reason that dictatorships suppress freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly, where people would turn out and see everyone else turning out, is that if you repress criticism, then people might be in the dark about what their fellow citizens think. They might think this regime is corrupt and cruel and tyrannical, but what do I know? Everyone else seems to be happy. And of course, everyone else seems to be happy because they know they'd be imprisoned if they actually criticize the government. So you can get what's called a spiral of silence, where people are afraid to speak out because no one else speaks out, and no one else speaks out because no one else speaks out. If you have a common knowledge generator, a highly public event, like a assembling in a public square, like a manifesto that's widely circulated, that can convert the private knowledge into common knowledge and lead to regime change, either whether by literally storming the palace or, as in Gandhi's case, by bringing the apparatus of the state to a halt through strikes and work stoppages, if they're coordinated.
It's interesting you mentioned the Super Bowl, because I wanted to, that's one of the few remaining cultural events that I think we have, like, a lot of people are fluent in or tuned to at the same time. What happens to the formation and the maintenance of common knowledge when you no longer have commonality of inputs and information? So when you and I were growing up, you mentioned TV news. When you and I were growing up, there were 3 or 4 newscasts, depending on whether there was a PBS in your market. They were half an hour long. We were all sort of getting a common script, and we were all speaking from that common script. In this age, the infinity of the internet, social media, how does common knowledge happen in the same way? Yeah. When there's this many different inputs and this many sources of information, and what are the implications of that?
Yeah, I think it's plausible that some of the polarization and fragmentation and silos and filter bubbles that we're seeing now comes from the fact that common knowledge is circulated only within a number of self-contained subnetworks. That common knowledge can be among any number of people, including just 2. But in the heyday of broadcast, a small number of broadcast media, indeed, everyone was watching Walter Cronkite, watching 60 Minutes, watching Saturday Night Live, reading Time magazine, and that is less true now when the common knowledge is generated in much smaller circles. First through cable news networks, most obviously Fox News, and then through social media feeds, which aren't literally common knowledge because everyone gets an individualized feed, but you get a sense in the networks of sharing and reposting that people kind of like you are all privy to the same information. And I think there's a second reason that in turn gives rise to proliferation of fake news and conspiracy theories and medical quackery and so on. And it may have been just a kind of happy coincidence that when for technological reasons, there are only a small number of networks or channels or major newspapers, then whoever was in charge, first of all, they had to appeal to the whole country. They couldn't write off half the country. If CBS did that, ABC would step in. And so it forced a kind of ecumenism or neutrality for sheer commercial reasons. Also, there was a feeling of some responsibility if it's just you and you're addressing 80 million or 120 million people, that there'd be some responsibility to standards of journalism like fact-checking, sourcing, editing. There was a kind of a reputation for accuracy. And one thing I think we've learned with the opening of the floodgates, where information flows freely in all directions and anyone can be a publisher, is how precious truth and objective knowledge is. That it's not enough to let information flow. I think 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that was a plausible idea. The truth will drive out falsehood if you just let everyone know everything. Turns out that I think we're coming to learn that unless an institution is explicitly dedicated to objective truth and has safeguards and norms and guardrails like editing, fact-checking, peer review, free speech, then it won't. And that's why science has its norms like empirical testability and peer review. Journalism has its norms of editing, fact-checking, publishing corrections. The legal system has its norms of the adversarial process, all of them very carefully engineered to try to get at the truth. Without that engineering, then you get nonsense, mishigas.
So is a conspiracy theory the antonym of common knowledge, or is it the epitome of common knowledge, but in a very, very small group?
I would say the latter.
Okay.
Yeah.
You mentioned norms. We talk a lot, one reads constantly, we talk constantly about the abandonment of norms, the breaking of norms. How much of that is the disintegration of common knowledge, and how scared should we be about that?
Yeah, so what are norms? They're ways of behaving that aren't literally enforced by the legal system. That's why we don't call them laws. But that exist as a matter of common knowledge. That is, you just don't do it. Well, why not? Well, everyone knows you don't do it. Well, who's everyone? Well, everyone knows that everyone knows you don't do it. And that's kind of what a norm is. And norms can change for better or for worse. When I was a child, there's nothing wrong with telling ethnic jokes on broadcast television. Jose Jimenez, the kind of bumbling Latino, the Polish jokes on Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, there's just nothing wrong with that. Now it would be cringeworthy. So it's a somewhat mysterious process how a norm gets entrenched or in the opposite direction unravels. But probably when a norm is violated, and it's common knowledge that it's violated in some public arena, then since the only thing propping up the norm was common knowledge, if now it is common knowledge that the norm can be flouted, it's no longer a norm. That's one of the reasons why people often feel the need to punish a norm breaker in public. And so you get social media shaming mobs. If someone makes a comment in social media that's deemed to be racist or misogynist, or in the case of the right, insufficiently respectful of Charlie Kirk, then the mob feels a need that person has to be shamed, humiliated, canceled, and everyone has to know about it. And I use a historic example to lay out that logic, and how, in fact, that, even though that sometimes can be good, we haven't lost anything by not telling ethnic jokes on broadcast television anymore, but it can run afoul of say, scientific discovery, which can seem to threaten a moral norm. And if scientists get mobbed, canceled, shamed for heresies, that can hold back the progress of science. So here's an example. There was a time in many parts of the country, this is still true, where Darwin's theory of evolution is thought to corrode the moral order. It's that if you believe that we're descended from apes, then you don't believe we were created by God, then you don't believe in the sanctity of God's commandments, and then morality will evaporate. I think most of us have a sounder basis for morality than just God created Adam and Eve in the 6 days. But nonetheless, there are people who feel that there's a moral norm at stake in adhering to the literal truth of the biblical narrative. And so there's a story, it turns out to be an apocryphal story, but it's a really good story. A wife of a vicar in 19th century England who, upon learning about Darwin's theory of natural selection, exclaimed, "Descended from apes, my dear, let us hope it is not true, but if it is, let us hope it not become widely known." Now, it turns out the aghast wife almost certainly never existed, but biologists love to tell the story. But what it captures is that what mortified the woman was not so much that it be true, but that it be widely known, or I would say commonly known, common knowledge. So we like to keep threatening facts out of common knowledge, even if it's privately believed.
If the common knowledge that a norm exists and that we should all follow it is replaced by the common knowledge that that norm can be broken and all is fair, is that a portal to chaos? Like, how is that? Common knowledge is a coordinating mechanism, and in many ways, as you've illustrated, it is the guarantor of stability. But if that common knowledge is about the ability of the norm to be abandoned, to be broken, Where does that lead?
Yes, I think it depends on the norm. So there were repressive norms, such as that women couldn't speak out, women couldn't swear. I mean, and some of those norms we don't miss. Some of them, though, we're in the process of seeing eroding, particularly in the political arena, where norms against blatant lying, blatant boasting, blatant insults are conspicuously flouted by Donald Trump, and especially when he was running for president. You may remember that there were regular predictions that his campaign was now over. He was doomed. The Hollywood Access tape, the insulting the Gold Star parents, insulting John McCain for having been captured and being a prisoner of war. There were certain norms that war heroes are sacred, and there's a certain amount of chivalry when it comes to women that Trump flouted, and he got away with it. So the question is, does that mean that the norm no longer exists, or is he kind of encapsulated as the one guy who can get away with it for whatever special aura he has? I think there is reason to think that the norm is certainly weakened and might be in the process of unraveling, because you see other public figures also flagrantly lying, not like the traditional politicians lie of, you deny it, you at least have a pretense of telling the truth, you try to wiggle out of it, you apologize, but just utter disregard as to whether something is preposterous or likely to be true. But you see, for example, Elon Musk. It used to be that a CEO would have to follow the norms of civility, self-control, honesty, dignity, and there are some others, Chris Rufo, Bill Ackman, that are just in your face, say in their X feed, in ways that I think would have been almost unthinkable 10 or 15 years ago. And so there might be a fear, and this would not be a good thing. The norm of honesty, respect, dignity, self-control, I think were pretty good norms. I shouldn't say in the past tense. They are pretty good norms. Let's hope I can stick to the present tense. I'm
going to ask you one last question, then I'm going to turn to the audience because we're actually getting short on time. So after this, we'll turn to them. This is just a really light question, really easy one. You've said in recent weeks, because I've been following your interviews, you've said that we are on our way to autocracy, and you've said that we're sliding into authoritarianism. How far on our way? How deep a slide? Where are we? How concerned should we be? And then we'll turn it over to cheerier questions from the audience.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to be hyperbolic. This is not a fascist country. I don't think it'll become a fascist country, but there are movements in that direction. So let me say 0.2 on a scale of 0 to 1.
Okay.
Maybe 0.3.
What'd you say?
Maybe 0.3.
Wait for tomorrow's news. It could be 4 or 5. Never.
What do you think about the increasing prevalence of realistic, authentic deepfakes it will have in terms of manipulating or biasing our sense of common knowledge?
Yeah, I suspect that if they continue to proliferate, there'll be a kind of increased epistemic inequality. That is, people who know all about deepfakes, know they're in danger of being fooled by deepfakes, have a commitment to objective truth, will only believe video from sources that can, whose reputation is pinned to only showing authentic videos. So I have a feeling that if there are a lot of deepfakes, I'd probably trust something that I still saw from the New York Times or on one of the major networks, and probably not from Jeremy's X feed. However, people for whom objective truth is not as important as tribal affiliation of boosting your side and truth schmooth who really cares, there it might get worse because there'll be more material that could if not fool them. It's not a question of fooling, because there may be an indifference as to whether it's true or false, but it could inflame them. So I think there'll be an increased demand for authenticated material among some people, but not everyone.
The human brain is a product of limited evolution, and computers are evolving a lot faster than we are. And in point of fact, they can mimic human behavior and play on human foibles. Is it an exact parallel, or is there something different about humanity than computers?
Just about the human brain versus, say, AI systems? Yeah, there are clearly differences. For example, a human can be intelligent with a couple of years of input. The equivalent of the amount of training that, say, ChatGPT gets would be about a childhood that lasts 30,000 years. There are other differences. The large language models are kind of parasites on a mammoth amount of material generated by humans. Kids don't have to access every Reddit post, every New York Times article, every Wikipedia article that's ever been written in order to be intelligent. There's an odd profile of strengths and weaknesses. Clearly, many ways in which large language models are smarter than us. They can do things, create 5 limericks on Gödel's incompleteness theorem. I couldn't do that. They can, passable ones. On the other hand, they continue to make boneheaded errors that no human would make because they don't have a model of reality. There are no propositions, there's nothing that's true or false, there's just statistical associations between words and categories of words that tend to come together. So there's a qualitative difference in addition to whatever smarter versus less smart difference there is. There are others too, that they have to be repeatedly trained. They can't, at least so far, they can't keep up with real-time incremental information. If I learn something, you say it in a sentence, you don't have to train me for several weeks for it to affect my knowledge. Whereas, just to give you an example, a friend of mine in South Africa is very upset that he happens to share a name with a prominent criminal. And so his business has suffered, his reputation has suffered, just because of the bad luck of having the same name. And because of AI, people look for him and they get all this information. And I tested it. I looked for my friend and I got information about this embezzler. And so I told GPT-5, there are 2 men with this name. You have given me the information for the other guy. And it said, oh, yes, okay, now, yes, you're right, there is a second guy. And I said, well, I am now telling you there are 2 guys. You are doing this person a lot of damage by not differentiating them. Can you change from this day forth? And it said, truthfully, I'm sorry, but I can't. I can't update my knowledge base that fast. So there's another qualitative difference between a human brain and a large language model that makes it hard to answer the question, is one smarter than the other? Large language models are a kind of new alien intelligent life form that we have not yet understood exactly how it works.
I was wondering if you or anyone in your department or that you know of have looked into whether it's more common or more readily shared common knowledge between people who are neurodivergent, as in like autistic or ADHD, amongst each other or with others.
Indeed. So the whole phenomenon of innuendo, euphemism, indeed the whole phenomenon of common knowledge is a kind of what psychologists call mentalizing or theory of mind, namely your intuitive theory of what's going through someone else's mind. That is precisely what is functioning less well in a person who's on the spectrum, who has what used to be called Asperger's syndrome, who is now often called neurodivergent. They tend not to be as good at getting inside other people's heads, let alone getting inside other people's heads, getting inside still other people's heads. And as a result, all the phenomena of indirectness, euphemism, politeness are often very challenging for people on the spectrum. So, for example, a person I know who has an autistic son reported that he would call home, the son would pick up the phone, he'd say, hi, is your mother at home? And the boy would say, yes, and just leave it at that, not realizing that is your mother at home means put her on the line. That is connecting the dots and inferring the intention behind the polite speech form. And a lot of what we call social skill, tact, savoir-faire, not being along the spectrum, neurotypical, consists of thinking through what is and what isn't common knowledge. And when there isn't common knowledge, to connect the dots, fill in the gaps, catch someone's drift.
At what point do the breaking of common knowledge norms start to affect the culture as a whole? Thinking in terms of today's political left and right.
In terms of in particular the political divide, or just in just general conduct?
The culture as a whole. There's common knowledge.
So as we discussed before, there is a threat to certain norms, particularly in the public arena, like not boasting, not insulting, not lying, which are indeed quite worrisome. In fact, I've had to retire a joke that I used to use in explaining common knowledge. It comes from the political writer Michael Kinsley, who said the definition of a gaffe in Washington is when a politician says something that is true. Well, I'm glad you can still laugh, because it comes from an era in which a politician's career could be ended if he blurted out something that in fact was true, but that insulted some constituency or some other politician. Now that we have shameless, leaders like Donald Trump, there's no such thing as a gaffe anymore. That is problematic. On the other hand, we're part of the general coarsening of popular culture is a process that's been going on for more than 100 years. It's there is a process of informalization in which, probably starting at the turn of the 20th century, in which there was less decorum, propriety, putting on airs, formality. Men stopped wearing hats, people stopped addressing each other with honorifics like Mr. and Mrs. and addressing each other on a first name basis, wearing work clothes or recreation clothes in the workplace, like jeans and shorts and so on, and sneakers. Even when I was a child, you just would not turn up to work in jeans and sneakers, including at a university. Now you can. Now, is there some optimal point at which we should stop this informalization and retain some norms of propriety? Yeah, I tend to think there is. But the reason that each generation seems like a fuddy-duddy and a prude to the next generation is that there has been this gradual informalization process.
Hey, hi, thank you for this. You're phenomenal. I have two quick questions and one more in-depth question. In the beginning,
let's keep it to one, just so that we can go to other people.
Okay, that's fine. I guess I would go with a fun one. Have you escaped the cave?
Have I escaped?
Yes.
The cave?
The thought of stuff, escaping the cave.
The cave.
Yes.
I see.
Yes.
Plato's cave.
Yes. You escaped.
Which I learned about from my other half, Rebecca Goldstein, who's in the audience, and wrote a book called Plato at the Googleplex, in which she brought Plato to life in the 21st century on a book tour. So that's how I learned about Plato's cave. Have I escaped the cave? Well, not in the sense of having a direct connection with reality, which necessarily is mediated by my sense organs, by what I've learned from the culture, but because I am in because my sense organs have been shaped by natural selection to prevent me from getting too out of touch with reality. I'm not hallucinating all the time. If I was, there'd be a lot of problems in my life, and likewise, whole train of ancestors, with the result that perception is pretty accurate about a lot of things, amplified by the fact that I'm in a culture with developed science, journalism, a legal system, institutions that try to keep our own shadow play aligned with the real world in as much as we can, then that's our escape from Plato's cave. The veridicality of perception through natural selection, to some extent amplified by truth-seeking institutions of an advanced society. That's my best. I hope I did okay.
Is there a relationship between common knowledge, or what becomes common knowledge, and emotion? How emotions play into what becomes common knowledge, and why?
Well, certainly when it comes to the common knowledge underlying our relationships, the emotion of awkwardness and other self-conscious emotions, guilt, embarrassment, shame, often come from breaching the norms that are common knowledge that bind people in a relationship. If you do something in a relationship that is violates the norms, then that leads to awkwardness. So an example, let's say you were having a dinner party. It was a nice warm evening, the guests all had a good time, and at the end one of the guests said, "This is really great, how much do I owe you for the meal?" Now, the norm in a friendship is you don't keep track, you don't keep score, you don't trade favors tit for tat. As in the joke, a guest says to a hostess, the cookies were delicious, I ate 4. And the hostess says, you ate 5, but who's counting? Now, the who's counting captures the norm that in a friendship, you don't count. The emotion of awkwardness comes when there are moments in a friendship, either when some inept person, as in the guest paying for the meal, just doesn't know what the norm, or when there are times, say, a friend, let's say one friend wants to sell their car to another friend and they kind of drive a hard bargain over the price. That feels awkward and it threatens the nature of the friendship. So awkwardness polices our relationships by generating a negative emotion when someone breaches the common knowledge norm that governs the relationship. And there are different norms for romantic relationships, for the family, for what you can say to a supervisor, what you can say to a teacher, what you can say to a sales clerk. And I go over these different kinds of relationships and what the governing common knowledge norms are.
Stephen, I'm told that is going to be our last question. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for the advice about maitre d's. Comes in handy, right? And I think it's safe to say, and really corny to say, please forgive me for this, it is common knowledge the time with you is time well spent. So thank you very much.